you need to position yourself as a doer in the context of a startup. And that's not an easy task to do when you're transitioning from a large company to a smaller company.
Hi, welcome back to SaaS Half Full, the only show serving B2B SaaS marketers. I'm Lindsay Groper, EVP of Panblast, and I will be both your host and bartender today. I had a lovely conversation with Niloy Sanyal, who is the CMO at LeanTaaS. And today we're talking about making the transition from a Fortune 500 CMO to more of a startup or scale-up environment. There's a lot of you CMOs out in transition right now. So if this is something that you're considering, this is the episode for you to understand what to look for, expectations of the role, what are some of the similarities, differences, challenges. Niloy comes from GE, so he has that Fortune 500 background experience and then has been working with LeanTaaS for the past 4 years, taking them from a startup to a growth stage company. So if you care to, join me for a drink as I have a conversation with Niloy. Hi, Niloy. Welcome to SaaS Half Full.
Oh, glad to be here, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's nice to meet you. And I can tell in your background that you are somewhere much nicer and warmer than I am in Indianapolis. Where are you calling from today?
I'm calling from our LeanTaaS headquarter offices in the Bay Area. So you can see the mountain view literally, as they call it. I don't know if the palm trees are local or not. I don't think so. But it's nice.
Well, and you were so kind to join me for a drink today. It's a little bit earlier in the afternoon today. And hopefully you are right-handed because for those of you who can't see, we appear to have some sort of an injury on our left hand or wrist.
Yes, so this is my first sports injury. I'm an avid tennis player, and a month ago, while playing doubles on a Sunday morning, I broke my wrist trying to defend a fall. Most important thing though is I won the point.
You
So
know
now,
that was going to be my next question.
yeah,
So
exactly. That's what the marketeers would all be keen to know. So I won the point, and I'm like semi-bionic because I have titanium plate, titanium nut. I'm very proud of the injury. So.
wow, you really broke it. Okay, so going through airport security is going to be different for you now.
Apparently, it's not because I've already flown
No?
like 4 times. Yeah, because titanium is a non-ferro alloy, so it
My
doesn't
gosh.
get shot. Yeah.
Look it. If you all of you listeners that say, you don't learn anything, look, you just learned about titanium. Okay? Come on. Well, it's nice to meet you. I am choosing a red wine today, a Cabernet. It is a little bit of a chilly day here in Indy, so cheers. It is nice to meet you. It
Yes.
looks like you went for the same thing.
Yeah. I guess we have a lot more in common than we thought.
Absolutely. Well, today we are going to be talking about making the transition from working with a global Fortune 500 company and jumping ship and going to what at first was startup life for you, now into a growth stage company, which we'll talk about. But there are a lot of CMOs in transition right now, to say the least, and more what seems like every year. And I'm sure some of you listening are thinking about what's my next best move? Or if I've traditionally worked in enterprise, what does that look like if I go to a smaller company? So Niloy, having both sides of the perspective there, is going to share some lessons learned and some advice in that arena. But before we dive into that, Niloy, I do want our listeners to have a sense of your background, sort of what was your journey to where you are today? What is your current role with LeanTaaS? And then, of course, we do want to know what LeanTaaS does and why the company exists. So I will hand her over to you.
No, it's great. Why don't I start with the last bit first, and then we can talk about my career, how I came to be where I am, so to say. So LeanTaaS stands for Lean Transformation as a Service. In a 30 seconds, if I were to describe what we do, is we use crazy math to open capacity within US hospitals. So all of us have been patient, or we know a loved one who's been in a patient going to a hospital. The biggest challenge that US health systems face is they just don't have enough capacity for the volume and the constraints that they have to meet, and which is why your wait times are crazy. So what we do is try to open up with AI and other sophisticated tools, open up the capacity, and then magic happens. So I'm the chief marketing officer. The way I describe my role is, if the board cares about one thing from the marketing team, it's very high quality pipeline that predicts the ability for our company to continue to grow. We've been growing over 30% year over year. And so high quality pipeline that can, and then the ability to build a brand that really helps us not just create the category that we have, but continue to lead the category that we've been able to do. So far, fingers crossed, we've been fairly successful in that. And like you alluded to, when I joined LeanTaaS 4 years ago in the midst of COVID, and that's a story by itself for another day.
Yeah.
We were a startup. We were Series C, getting ready for a new raise. 4 years, which felt frankly more like 8 years, but 8 great years, if you were to put it that way. We're now officially a growth equity fund. We have a private equity ownership with Bain Capital. Goldman Sachs continues to have a significant stake, inside partners. We're at scale, 350 employees, and looking forward to what the next chapter brings in. So that's a little bit about LeanTaaS. And you asked my profile. It's interesting if I look back, Lindsay, I actually did not know I was going to be in marketing when I started my journey, call it professional journey. I was actually coincidentally, in Lean Six Sigma. In those days, dating myself 20 plus year, Lean Six Sigma was the AI of that time, right? Like people didn't know, what math was, and that was the starting point of it. So it's kind of coincidental, or sort of nice coincidence, that I am now working for a company called Lean Transformation as a Service when I started my career in Lean and Six Sigma. But when I started, it was in process improvement. My background was in engineering. I was an MBA. And then, because Six Sigma in those days were a big deal, in fact, GE essentially said you would not be able to be promoted to any leadership role if you were not a black belt, Six Sigma black belt. So I joined GE, spent 15 years with GE, which was phenomenal. I really enjoyed my career at GE. Fortune 100, I guess you could say Fortune. And the reason I enjoyed it, because it never felt like having worked for one company. I lived in 9 different countries. I've done pretty much every function you can think of, with the exception of manufacturing and HR. Although, if I were to call the head of HR that I've worked with closely, he'll say, "No, Niloy, you can be an honorary HR manager as well." So, which was phenomenal. I don't think there are many places still, I would say, in US or globally, that you can work for a company that gives you that diversity of experience. But I also felt I always was a marketer wanting to be in a smaller place. Like, I call it like a startup marketer caught in the cage of a large company. So I always gravitated within GE trying to do the entrepreneurial stuff. So when GE was betting on the software space back in mid 2000s, 2008, 2009, I should say late 2000, I was one of the first employees. I was reporting at that time to the chief marketing officer at GE, Beth Comstock. Beth is one of my favorite people on earth. Like, she really helped me identify my North Star, and continues to be a coach that I can call on. But the fact that she gave me a chance, and she took a risk on me to help her navigate this journey of GE. She was tasked by Jeff Immelt at that time to set up this innovation paradigm and getting into software. I couldn't spell software if my life depended on it. But because she put me into this role to say, let's go figure it out together, I think that was absolutely phenomenal experience. And having being in the front seat and learning through mistakes more than learning through successes, I would say, let's see. So that was great experience. And when the opportunity came back in 2018 to, move from LeanTaaS, my stepping stone before coming to LeanTaaS was actually a mid-sized public company. So more than anything else, it helped me have more credibility with the startup world in the Silicon Valley, to say, okay, this is not just a big company bureaucracy type of a marketeer. He knows how to roll up his sleeve and get stuff done. And I would give you a lot of insights in how important it is for a marketer that is transitioning from a larger company to a startup or a growth company. It's really important that you understand that the hiring manager, hopefully the CEO, has a major bias against you. They think you are a big company person, so you have lots of people who do things for you, and you're there just being a coach or a manager. And that's obviously the wrong message. If you're going to be in a startup or a growth equity company, the hands-on element is so important. So I can talk a lot about what helps you being able to convert that.
So you almost had a stair step approach. I guess what ultimately, though, motivated you to transition into that smaller company with LeanTaaS, right? You'd sort of known one thing and known one world. And granted, you went, to a bit smaller, but still working within a public company. What was that motivation for you? And I guess what was the turning point or the decision point where you said, this is the right move?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I would say, pardon me for using some cliches, but I do think good marketers have a lot of options, right? They can go in multiple industries. We have a role that is largely fungible. You can move from one industry to another, one space to another. But I do think B2B and B2C are two worlds apart. I don't think it's easy or even appropriate for a B2B marketer to switch to B2C or vice versa after a certain period of time. So if you stay within those two pillars, I do think it does come down to first and foremost the mission of the company. If you, as a marketer, you're a storyteller at the end of the day. If you don't buy into the story of what your company and your product stand for, you're going to fail. So to me, being in healthcare was really important. Having been a GE in pretty much like 20 different industries, the one that I've naturally gravitated towards the healthcare space. So that was really one criteria in my level of criteria. The second one was, to me, the culture of the company, right? Not the financials, not the strategy, the culture. I think all marketers, after a certain point, will tell you we want to be in a place where we have the permission to make an impact. If you're going into a company where you don't even have the permission to make an impact, do not join that company. 9 out of 10 times you can figure that out during the interview stage if you've done your homework, right? It's the vibe of the hiring managers, how the people talk about what marketing is going to be. I was very fortunate to have found a company like LeanTaaS where the hiring manager at that point was one of the first product marketing leader of Google. And so he was very tuned into understanding what marketing can and cannot do. So that, I think, is another signal. And last but not the least, I would say understanding the strategy aspects of it. And for me, what was really important to come to a startup, Series C, I don't think I would have been the right fit for a Series A or a Series B. There is a different profile for that, right? For a Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 lead marketer to come to a startup, you really want product market fit for at least the core product to have been sorted out. Otherwise, you're bringing the wrong tool for the problem that you're trying to solve for. And for me, the biggest reason for joining and coming to a startup was agency. In a larger company, a lot of times what you're trying to do is constrained by the factors that, like, headquarter drives the marketing stack. As just an example, you don't get to choose what marketing stack you want to test or experiment with. Even the way your hiring processes work need to be blessed by the headquarter and so on. Whereas in a startup, the decisions you make and the impact you see, there's a straight line to that. And so it's all up to you to a certain extent. You don't have the luxury of saying, oh, let me go check with the headquarters. So there, it obviously comes with its own risks. But I love that. I love the idea of having agency to constantly experiment, but also then scale up. The advantage a larger company's CMO or a head of marketing or product marketing, or any of the functions has, is you already know what scale looks like, the good and the bad and the ugly, right? And so you've seen the dysfunctionalism in a larger company and how to avoid it, number one. Number two, you also know the advantages of scale that a startup or a growth company does not have the ability to. So you know what staircases you need to get to scale and not have the bad habits and bring in the good habits of scale. I think at the end of the day, no CEO of a startup wants to stay the CEO of a startup, wants to be the CEO of a larger company, whether it's public or private, doesn't matter. So I think you take the advantages, but also learn from the disadvantages and bring that package together into your conversation. And I'll just end by saying, Lindsay, it doesn't matter what you want. For you to be able to crack into, especially in the technology space, which is highly competitive, you need to position yourself as a doer in the context of a startup. And that's not an easy task to do when you're transitioning from a large company to a smaller company.
I starred that because you've said it twice, and I'm gonna come back to that point. I wanted to finish out this discussion around culture because there's good cultures, there's bad cultures. And you mentioned a couple though of cultural shifts or differences between the two, autonomy and the risk associated with that. Outside of a good or a bad culture, What, just realistically though, what are some other expectations that you should have around how the culture is different at a smaller scale company?
I think first and foremost is the pedigree of the executive team. What has been their background? Where are they coming from? In an enterprise B2B, especially technology company, appreciation, and good marketeers will suss this out by just looking at the website. How well do the customers see their product? Back to the product market fit. It's really not that easy in a private context, company's context, to understand how the company is doing, right? Like you're essentially dating at the interview stage. So how do you know the financials, the strategy? One great way to know is how do the customers speak about the product and the people of this company? And great companies will showcase that on the website. Why wouldn't they? And so the companies that showcase it, they have a great product market fit. Of course, you will also be able to suss through the publicly available content. How well is their brand appreciated? How well are they underwhelmed? Are they overshooting? And which is equally bad. So you got to find the just right fit. So I would say those two market conditions, and do your diligence, right? If you are doing a good job and you're getting a retained search firm, which is usually a good signal. If you're not with a retained search firm, or you don't know the executive hiring manager personally, I think you're probably already making a mistake, in my opinion, because if the company hasn't bet on a retained search firm, then they're not serious about this role. They want to keep the cost down. So lots of things to unpack there. But bottom line, culture, I would say, definitely have a criteria, like a checklist. In fact, I know you and I are both connected with Kate Bullis. Kate has a whole checklist that she was coaching me as I was going through this transition. That checklist is phenomenal. Have that checklist. You need to work as if you are an investor. That's the way you got to think about the company culture, financials. Don't be afraid. Initially, you want to make them fall in love with you. In the first, second, third round, make them fall in love with you. By the way, that's a whole thing to unpack itself. How do you make someone fall, especially when they have a bias to say, hey, you're a big company person. You've impressed the recruiter to at least have a conversation. Now, what do you do? And the one thing I would say, Lindsay, you have to assume you're up against the stream, swimming against the stream to be able to convince them. I still remember my hiring manager talks about this later on. The one statement I made in my first interview that resonated with my hiring manager, I told him anything I tell you verbally is not going to convince you otherwise that this is a big company person trying to get into a startup. But give me a chance. I want to come back to you and I want to take a look at some of your challenges and what is third party available and provide you my context of how I would recommend. And he gave me that, and I really put together a strong perspective without talking to anyone on what I think is the challenge. And of course, based on some of the feedback on what I would do in the first 30, 60, 90 days. I think that blew the person away, the hiring manager away. So put in your effort. Don't go with chip in your shoulder to say, oh, I'm GE, oh, I'm Oracle, or I'm Salesforce, so hence you would be lucky to have me. That doesn't work. There are so many people who have done the startup world and successfully so, that for someone who's coming from a bigger company, you really have to convince them that you're going to be able to pull up your sleeves. They don't expect you to know everything. They don't want somebody who knows how to do HTML, web coding, set up the marketing stack from scratch, which is why you're not a Series A startup as a marketing person. If you were, you need to know all that, but you need to know how to drive business value, and then how do you hire team and the agencies to pull it all together and have the right mindset, but at the same time being able to pull up your sleeve and execute really, really well. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, yeah, because I did underline that about the CEO already has a bias against you, and to know that going in, I mean, it makes sense, right? You've been orchestrating for a long time. Is there also doubt that even if you say you can do, that you even know how to do, if you've been out of the game for so long, right? I mean, you and I talked before I hit record about Gen AI and how much that has fundamentally changed, and this is just like very recent history, let alone how it's impacted, on the practitioner level. Is there a sense of like, you, dude, you're so far out of the game from doing that, how are you ever going to do again?
No, absolutely. I mean, Gen AI is such a, you and I were talking before the podcast, this is probably one function, marketing, which has had the most technological shift in the last 2 decades, right? Like the marketing tech stack that we are working with didn't even exist at all 20 years ago when I started being a marketeer, right? Like the idea of a CRM and a marketing automation tool didn't exist. Those came on board. And now there are like 500 applications that a CMO can bet on. In fact, I believe there was a Gartner study that the CMO's budget in most corporations these days is one of the highest. And that's true in my case. Like, I was in a board meeting recently, and the board said, "Hey, if we give you $2 million more, what can you do with it?" That's the conversation you want to have. What can you do with it? And of course, you got to have the board's mindset. Like, are you measuring LTV to CAC ratio? Are you measuring the percentage growth attributable to marketing, and so on and so forth? So, Gen AI to me is just the newest iteration of the technology stack. But the difference is going to be this is going to be another game changer, which will completely redefine, in my opinion, what go to market function looks like. Some in good ways, some in bad ways. But if you're a marketer that's transitioning from a large company to a smaller company and you don't know how to spell generative AI and how to experiment it at scale, all parts of the marketing execution, by the way, whether it's content creation to personalization of messaging to website to how do you interact with your SDRs and sales team, account management, ABM at steroids, every aspect of that is going to be impacted. So I am probably spending 30% of my personal time on this, and I'm really enjoying, and the initial outcome that we're seeing is phenomenal. One thing I would say is none of the vendors, and I put in a lot of effort evaluating everyone in go to market right now, has been able to get to where, at least in enterprise B2B, I need to get to, right? Like for us, we have, call it 1,000 health system in US. Every one of them effectively is an account based management execution, right? And to me, Gen AI is like perfectly suited on how you execute from a go to market engine perspective. So happy to go a little bit deeper. And the way I describe this is, as a marketer the last 2 years, only now I've kind of gotten a little bit less squirmish. I used to feel half the days I woke up with someone feeling like punched my gut, and the other half was like euphoria that I was on LSD or something. That's how you should feel. If you're not feeling that, if you're not using these Gen AI tools personally every day, right? And I would make a plug for ChatGPT for sure, but also Perplexity. I love Perplexity as a research tool, as a almost like thousands of analysts and smart marketeers are now on your fingertips, right? My CEO jokes like, Niloy, I can make out when you're getting me an answer through ChatGPT or not, and to the extent that he has become hooked in it too. So that's the equation you got to have to use these tools. Get into the front line and start using it.
I'm not at the point where I think Gen AI first and I need to get to that point. Like I'll spend brain power on something and then I get super pissed off at myself because I'm like, why? Why did I just do that? I should have just gone straight to whatever tool you want to use as a starting point, or they probably could have solved that for me. But I'm using all this time and brain power on it, and we all know not to replace it, but as a as a starter to get the idea going. So I need to get better at thinking first about that. And I'm not quite there yet. But I did want to underscore what you said, which is experiment at scale, because those words don't typically go together, right? And so I did want to just ask a follow-up question about that, of how can you do that responsibly when you're doing that at scale?
So the first thing I would say, even before you decide experimenting at scale, what is the North Star? Like in my case, as I was mentioning, the board, the CEO expects us to deliver from marketing function two things mainly. One is quality pipeline for all of our products over the next 12, 24 months. Our deal cycles are 9 to 12 months, and our annual contract value average deal size is about $1 million. So it's a very expensive product, an AI based software solution, as well as it takes a long time to. So if you don't have robust pipeline, you're not going to meet your numbers next year, which I love. Which I love that every board meeting, the three slides I have to present is how much pipeline have we created and how much pipeline is active for us to deliver, because you want to be in that position. If you're not in that position as a marketeer, you're failing, right? Number two is the brand, which is a much harder thing to measure, right? To me, brand is not just one, it's like saying quality. It's not one function's responsibility. It's definitely not the same as brand identity. People confuse brand to be brand identity. There's a little bit of an education. It's the aggregation of all the experiences. And this makes the CMO, my CEO, current CEO, will tell me this, like, he hasn't seen a marketer like me in his previous experience because I've got fingerprints in everything from customer success to product execution, product launches to customer support and all of that aspect. Why? Because that's what the brand is. Unless you're able to get all parts of your customer experience to be rising up, you're not going to have a great brand, right? So from a perspective of what experimentation at scale means, is be very thoughtful on those two metrics. A lot of marketeers, I think, spend a lot of time on brand, but brand doesn't give you necessarily equal outcome, and they think of brand as advertising. I actually spend almost $0 in paid advertising. Now, it could be a function of the vertical nature of the industry we are in, and the fact that you're marketing to fairly scientists, like people who've gone through 20 years of education and they have a very high level of skepticism. But I do think this is important, that performance marketing is what keeps the machine running. You got to focus on that. Experimentation is important there, but what's really important is getting 4 years ago, I was doing 80% of experimentation because there was no baseline. Now I'm doing less than 20% of experimentation. And the right answer is 80/20. At scale, if you're not doing 80% of repeatable execution, you're going to fail, right? And then 20% is really important because things change, technology stack change, competitive landscape change, you're coming up with new products. All of that means you got to constantly on the brand element is much harder from a scale perspective because it's a lot more touchy feely aspect. Now in my industry, the brand aspect comes really out when you're doing large events, industry events. I mean, not just in my industry. Look at what Dreamforce is. Dreamforce and every tech company has been able to create this at scale. Is the event becomes the personification of the brand. It drives performance marketing, but you can gauge the quality and the health of the brand if you were attending the event. You'll see customer testimonials. You'll see how customers are talking about this, especially the user group users, which are not the budget decision makers. How do they feel about the products and the new offerings? Those aggregations. So I spend a lot of time. Coincidentally, in 2 weeks from now, Lindsay, we're going to have our biggest ever industry event. We call it Transform, which is a interesting play on the LeanTaaS because the T in the TaaS is transformation as a service. And we want to set it up as an industry event. We want our customers, our users, our industry partners, thought leaders, reporters and publications to all come in and coalesce around this topic of the mission of the company and the industry, which is, hey, we've got to do the right thing for the patient. So that, I think, is the way I would measure experimentation of a scale. We're doing a lot of experiment at this event because this is our first like big moment in time in the industry, if that helps.
We have time for one more question. I have a lot. So I'm going to have you take your pick of which one you want to talk about next. I have a question around KPIs, one around resource allocation, and one around tech stack. Where do you want to go? Choose your own
Yeah, I think we
adventure.
kind of talked about tech stack with Gen AI, which is a tech stack, by the way, tech stack on steroids to a certain extent. So let's maybe not do that. Let's do the resource allocation because we're all in the budget cycle coming fourth quarter, right? So that could be interesting.
Yeah. I want you to unpack. So, first, like the differences in going from a GE to a LeanTaaS. And even if you think about when you first joined, LeanTaaS when they were more Series C phase, what do CMOs need to realistically know about if they jump ship to a smaller company, how that budgeting and just resource allocation process is going to go?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I would say when you're coming in the 30, 60, 90 days, do not focus on budget. It's kind of an almost like a it's an orthodoxy because you're coming in the first 30, 60, 90 days to experiment for which you don't need a lot of budget. And look, series C, D, they have some kind of an annual budget cycle, but they don't really care about it, right? It's a quarter to quarter cycle, right? And that's what the investors care. 1 year is too long for you to plan. So come in the first 90 days, make sure while you're learning the business, while you're talking to customer, while you're talking to the team, you're doing some experiments that have a reasonably high chance of success. And this is where the network, Lindsay, what you are doing here is helping us build a network. We shouldn't all feel like we're islands of one individual that we need to solve everything. Talk to your network, because you might be considering something as experiment, but your peers somewhere else might have already succeeded in that space. So find out that, so it's not an experiment. 90 days, succeed in 1 2 experiments that then the executives say, wow, Niloy knows what he's talking about. He's already showing some impact that we've struggled to build over the last 2 3 years. So he's really the right person to that. That will give them confidence to continue to reinvest in your function. So that's what you need in a series. I would call it B, C, even a D, because you don't want to come into the CEO's office or the CFO's office as part of the budget cycle and say, oh, I'm going to be really sad if you don't put in this much budget in that. Earn your keep, so to say, and then continue to have them reinvest. And that's how the operations work. Where I am in a growth equity stage or growth stage, yes, budgeting cycles really, really important. The way I am tackling that, and this is back to like having had the experience of having worked with a larger, I have a very good understanding of what the CFO is looking for, and hence the board is looking for. At the end of the day, in SaaS especially, there are very well understood SaaS metrics, right? Revenue as a percentage of go to market cost. Talked about LTV to CAC, productivity from the SDRs or BDR, whatever that might be in your function. So that function rolls into my, which helps for me to have the full ownership. So I'm not like the MQL team, I'm the real pipeline team, right? It doesn't matter what the org design is. You really need to make sure you're owning the full pipeline. Show them the impact and then tell them what is the math. This is not like AI math. It's just simple logic, right? These are your products, these are your upsell, this is your cross sell opportunity. Recent historical conversion rates for each stage of the pipeline is this is how much active pipeline we have. Hence, given your deal cycle, how much pipeline do I need to build? And then what does it cost? And then put in some market assumption, because, like I was saying, a lot of things change. So I'm, in fact, happy to share a blank template you can provide to your audience if they were interested to look at that. It's not rocket science, by the way. This is also a thing that you can ask ChatGPT and it'll give you the answer how to build the template. But I think what's important is to have a relationship with the CEO and CFO, to understand the business dynamics, understand the market strategy. I almost feel like chief marketing officer title should change to chief market officer. We really need to back into our budget planning and resource planning from a market in perspective, not company out perspective, because then you'll only see what you've done and not be able to see what's coming down the pipe and where do we need to invest in and what does M&A look like, and hence design the team with that kind of mindset.
Our mutual friend Kate Bullis would agree with that chief market officer title.
I
I believe
know.
she's placed a few chief market officers. There's a whole movement to get rid of the ing, which focuses on the doing, and focus really more on the market, which is where the power of that role comes in. So awesome. Well, I asked all of my guests the same question to send us out, which is, do you have a signature or favorite toast to send us out?
I would say hail to Gen AI. That would be my toast. Yeah, the
Wow, that's a first one. Hail to Gen AI. I will drink to that.
there you go.
Thanks again for joining me. I loved the conversation.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's been a pleasure.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks again to Niloy for joining me on SaaS Half Full. First time we have had a toast dedicated to Gen AI. All hail Gen AI. Hopefully, you took a couple things away from this conversation. And if you are thinking of making the transition to a startup or a scale up, good luck to you in that journey. Really appreciate the listen. And until next time, bottoms up.